Hello, my name is Shannon Allen, and I'm a doctoral student at North Central University studying psychology with an emphasis on crisis and trauma. Today I'm going to discuss key findings related to research on risk and predictive factors associated with mass shootings. But first, let's do an overview of the topic that we'll cover: definitions and prevalence, common characteristics such as behavioral characteristics of the perpetrator, motives, warning signs, weapons, and locations, and current legislation aimed at reducing the prevalence of mass shootings. The Federal Bureau of Investigations defines a mass shooting as a single incident that takes the lives of 4 or more people and occurs within the same general time frame and geographical location. This is distinguished from a spree shooting that happens in the same general time frame but in different locations, such was seen in the most recent Odessa, Midland, Texas shootings. Mass shootings tend to be characterized as public events with ambivalent motives. However, based on the FBI's definition, mass shootings can also refer to familicide or felony mass homicide, which are distinguished by a criminal objective. Although public mass shootings account for the smallest portion of all mass shootings, this presentation will primarily focus on public mass shootings due to the complex range of causal considerations. While mass shootings are rare, only accounting for 1% of all firearm deaths, they have consistently increased in prevalence and fatalities over the past 20 years. Common characteristics I'm going to overview are race, gender, general behavioral similarities, general motives, warning signs, locations, and weapons used. Males with a mean age of 34 committed nearly all public mass shootings. White males accounted for 49% of public mass shootings, while black males accounted for 31%. Public mass shooters have been characterized as detached, isolated, narcissistic, paranoid, and with few social and familial ties. They tend to possess persecutory ideologies and have external loci of control. In addition, Palermo suggested that public mass shooters saw themselves as having superior power over society that permitted them to exterminate perceived threats. However, despite these discerning characteristics, most public mass shooters had not been diagnosed with a mental illness. Nevertheless, it is important to note that many had unofficial reports of emotional disturbances from friends, family, co-workers, classmates, and so on. While specific motives are difficult to detect, generally, a personal grievance motivates mass shooters towards specific individuals, like co-workers or classmates, a class of individuals based on gender, race, political ideology, and religious beliefs, or society in general. In addition to the previously mentioned characteristics, one study found that explicit warning signs were present in the majority of public mass shootings. For example, of the deadliest mass shootings, 80% of perpetrators communicated their interest in mass shootings, and 86% disclosed violent intentions and thoughts. However, alarmingly, only half of these behaviors were reported to the police, and 80% were still able to obtain guns legally despite visible warning signs. The majority of public mass shootings occur in rural and suburban areas. Workplaces are the most common locations of mass public shootings. Schools and religious entities follow, with schools accounting for 15% and places of worship accounting for 5%. Because the general aim of public mass shootings is to kill as many individuals as possible, guns are typically the weapon of choice. At 82%, handguns are overwhelmingly the most common weapon used, followed by rifles, then shotguns. According to Yelderman and colleagues, there was a 17% victim increase per weapon brought to the scene and a 59% victim increase when rifles were involved. The majority of weapons used in public mass shootings were purchased legally. Legislative efforts aimed at decreasing the prevalence of mass shootings have typically been partisan and dichotomous, with one side advocating for more gun control laws and the other for mental health reform. However, experts in the field of criminology, sociology, and psychology have faulted policymakers for considering only a narrow range of contributing factors. Levin and Madfus noted that reactive legislative efforts did little more but reduce public anxiety and produce the illusion that policymakers were fixing the problem. However, as noted by the increase in mass shootings, these policies have failed. Similarly, Schildkraut and Hernandez wrote that public discourse often resulted in ineffective feel-good legislation. More specifically, Rosenberg found no empirical evidence to support gun control policies that focused on firearms restrictions for the mentally ill. She further posited that such policies further increase the public perception that the mentally ill were inherently dangerous, noting that such stigma could create barriers to treatment. Moreover, Kapoor and colleagues discovered that risk-based gun removal laws, like red flag laws, were seldom used and only used in response to suicide threats, not homicide threats. However, gun control legislation should not be entirely disregarded. Universal background checks have been determined to decrease gun homicide rates in U.S. urban areas, but not rural and suburban communities. In contrast, the prohibition of firearm attainment by those convicted of violent misdemeanors decreased firearm homicide rates in rural and suburban areas, but did not impact rates in large cities. Though it is essential to consider that these findings were concerning felonious homicides, given that most mass shootings occur in rural and suburban communities, it may be important to determine if these findings are relevant to public mass shootings. The remainder of this presentation aims to review and evaluate the literature on risk, protective, and predictive factors concerning mass shootings in order to better inform prevention policies that, presently, have failed to decrease the prevalence of public mass shootings. Many theories have attempted to describe the etiology of mass shootings. However, they have been faulted for having the same monolithic approach as policies and legislation. For example, routine activities theory proposes that 3 criteria must be present for a mass shooting to occur: the availability of targets, the absence of defenders such as security guards, and the desire to kill. While routine activities theory focuses on direct and immediate factors, early versions of strain theory posited that failures, disappointments, and struggles that emerge from social, structural, and class barriers, physical and mental deficits, and chronic illness led to criminal behaviors. Agnew expanded upon early strain theories by including dysfunctional or disappointing social relationships. Similar to Agnew's general strain theory, control theory argues that strong relationships with non-deviant individuals, groups, and institutions foster adherence to social norms, prevent perceptions of marginalization, and thus decrease the likelihood of criminal behavior. We will be exploring risk, protective, and predictive factors related to mass shootings from the perspective of cumulative strain theory. The cumulative strain model of mass shootings resolves deficits found in monolithic theories and dichotomous policies. Cumulative strain draws upon previous theories to present a comprehensive model that considers a broad range of both implicit and explicit sequential factors that lead to the genesis of a mass shooter. Levin and Mathis's cumulative strain theory proposes that mass shooters pass through several stages. Stage 1, chronic strain, describes issues noted by early strain theorists such as persistent financial difficulties, family issues, academic or workplace failures, rejection, and bullying. Stage 2, uncontrolled strain, occurs when individuals are unable to bond with a supportive network of peers. They either become isolated or connect with deviant groups. Stage 3, acute strain, is marked by a specific event. While these events may seem benign, for the individual who has experienced chronic and unmitigated frustration, disappointment, and isolation, the event is perceived as catastrophic, or as described by Levin and Mathis, the final straw. Validating cumulative strain theory, Silver, Simmons, and Cron discovered a series of acute and cumulative strains experienced by mass shooters 1 year before the event. Of 63 shootings occurring between 2000 and 2013, 39% of perpetrators experienced emotional strains, 31% experienced financial strains, 18% experienced relationship issues, 14% experienced physical injuries, and 4% experienced the death of a family member or close peer. Other strains included conflicts with parents and other family members and peers, struggles with alcohol and drugs, and criminal or civil problems. According to Levin and Mathis, once the individual enters stage 4, the planning stage, the likelihood of prevention decreases significantly. This implies that preventative measures are essential before the individual develops the desire to kill. However, stage 5, the event, leaves room for last chance measures noted in routine activities theory and often illustrated by reactive legislation. Levin and Mathis argued that in order for the event to occur, the individual must have access to and be proficient with a firearm and must have unmitigated access to a large group of people. Cumulative strain theory, while comprehensive, also demonstrates a complex etiology of mass shootings. It implicates a broad range of individual factors such as developmental issues, personality types, and mental illness symptomology, environmental factors such as location, access to firearms, childhood trauma, and media contagion, and socio-demographic factors such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status to consider in the development of prevention programs and policy. While broad, researchers have embarked on the lofty task of parsing and analyzing singular factors and describing their roles in the evolution of a mass shooter. Levin and Mathis noted that cumulative strain was not a blueprint for all mass shootings, nor did they imply that every individual that experiences chronic, uncontrolled, and acute strain would develop the desire for mass violence. However, certain personality types, some related to early development, may inform the coping skills of strained individuals and better help determine the likelihood of violent behavior. Similarly, while mental illness is not a proven antecedent to mass shootings, common symptomologies may provide some insight on at-risk individuals. While cumulative strain theory does not explicitly implicate early childhood strains, several studies have examined the impact of developmental barriers, their cumulative effects, and how they inform violent behaviors. In utero exposure to illicit drugs and alcohol has, in many cases, resulted in anoxia and low birth rates that often leave the child with neuropsychological deficiencies. For example, poor emotional regulation as a result of neuropsychological issues has been linked to early onset aggression. Although early onset aggression is not directly associated with mass shootings, environmental factors that complicate this condition tend to result in abnormal and deviant beliefs about violence. Peer responses related to problematic behaviors associated with early onset aggression may include bullying, rejection, and marginalization, which can result in isolation. While early research suggested that mass shooters tended to have low self-esteem, current research argues otherwise. Several studies have found an association between violence and narcissism. However, one recent study found that a large number of mass shooters in particular had narcissistic traits. Along with narcissism, psychopathy and Machiavellianism were described by Paul Hess and Williams as the dark triad of personality due to their associations with violent behavior. While psychopathy and Machiavellianism are not established risk factors for mass shootings, together with narcissism, they describe dispositions such as apathy, entitlement, and power over others that appear to influence the onset of violent behavior. Few mental illness-related symptoms have been associated with violence, though none are specifically associated with mass shootings. Command hallucinations and delusions increase the risk for violent perpetration, especially when they co-occur with anger or strain. Substance abuse may also increase the risk of violent behaviors in those suffering from a severe mental illness. However, overall, there is no empirical evidence supporting popular beliefs that mental illness causes mass shootings or the presence of mental illness can predict mass shootings. Though it is essential to note that the low prevalence of mass shootings in contrast to other types of gun violence may make statistical modeling in relation to the presence of mental illness difficult to construct. Often the sample size and available data are too small to draw any statistically significant conclusions. Nonetheless, the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study was one of the first to conclude that the mentally ill were at no higher risk for committing violence than the general public. Expanding upon the MVRAS, Swanson and Belden discovered that the mentally ill were more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators. One of the conclusions drawn from the MVRAS was that social and environmental factors played a more significant role in the commission of violence than psychopathy. Again, broadening the scope of the MVRAS, Swanson and Belden also found that a complex interplay between individual factors and environmental factors over time increased the risk of violent perpetration. Aside from general characteristics such as the high prevalence of mass shootings in rural and suburban areas compared to urban areas, few studies have examined specific characteristics related to the locations of mass shootings. However, one recent study compared schools where mass shootings occurred to schools in the same state with no shootings. Schools with mass shooting incidents had significantly larger enrollments than schools in the same state and had smaller student-to-teacher ratios. In addition, school shooters experienced a significant increase in enrollment size when transitioning from their previous school level to the level where the school shooting occurred. Concerning cumulative strain, these findings suggest that perhaps transitioning from a smaller school to a larger school with smaller student-to-teacher ratios may create stressors that exacerbate already existing strains. While no research exists that examines specific workplace and place of worship characteristics, Work done by Levin and Mathis suggested that locations with easy ingress and egress and with large crowds of people were vulnerable targets. One study posited that businesses and schools with credential integrated access control were at lower risk. However, the efficacy of such measures was mostly dependent on the vigilance of the credential holders. As seen in the Las Vegas shooting, entry and escape would have been difficult to mitigate given the outdoor public venue. Comparing the deadliest mass shooting in recent history, Las Vegas, and the second deadliest, Virginia Tech, it is reasonable to assume that location may influence weapon type. The Virginia Tech shooting occurred in a closed space with difficult escape for victims, yet the shooter was able to take the lives of 30 students and faculty using only handguns. Conversely, the Las Vegas shooting occurred in an open space with easy escape, but the shooter used rifles with longer ranges than handguns to take the lives of 58 concertgoers. One could surmise that the vulnerability of a specific location is primarily moderated by weapon type. As previously discussed, access to firearms has but a distal influence on the early prevention of mass shootings. Nonetheless, there are important factors to consider. Juveniles involved in bullying, whether victim or perpetrator, are more likely to carry a weapon than other juveniles. This is an essential consideration given that bullying is a common strain for youth. The desire for youth involved in bullying to arm themselves may be rooted in cultural norms about masculinity. Less physically developed male juveniles may find weapon ownership as a means to compensate for the lack of outward presentations of masculinity. This is likely true for male adults as well. While the previous findings shed light on why juveniles carry weapons, they also open a dialogue about where youth obtain weapons. It is noted that most mass shooters under the age of 18 illegally obtain their weapons from parents or other relatives. Unsupervised and unmitigated access to household weapons may explain why, for every 1% increase in household gun ownership, gun-related youth homicides increase by 2.4%. In 1998, researchers from the CDC concluded a groundbreaking study that examined the lifelong impacts of childhood trauma. Although the Adverse Childhood Experiences study did not specifically mention trauma as an antecedent to violence, researchers have since examined the role adverse childhood experiences play in serious, violent, and chronic, or SVC, juvenile offenders. Some studies have implicated the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis that is compromised due to persistent toxic stress. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis is associated with aggression, impulsivity, and violence. More specifically, the adverse childhood experiences that have been evaluated in connection with violent behaviors are emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, community violence, household substance abuse, household mental illness, and an incarcerated family member. Emotional and physical abuse and household violence, substance abuse, and mental illness were significantly rated to SVC juvenile offenders. Exposure to domestic violence was also associated with impulsivity and reactive aggression. It is also true that children exposed to domestic violence will, in general, create social psychological convictions that forceful impulsivity and violence are normal reactions to issues. Given that domestic violence also has a positive relationship with increased gun possession and arrests related to gun violence in juveniles, it is easy to assume a causal pathway between household instability and mass shootings. Similarly, community violence was related to increased gun possession, reactive and proactive aggression. However, these studies found that the most influential ACE predictive factor of gun violence was having an incarcerated family member. While these studies did not examine adverse childhood experiences within the context of mass violence, the Violence Project, who is currently conducting mass shooting research funded by the National Institute of Justice, recently released a statement regarding the connection between mass shootings and childhood trauma. They informed that their research had found that an overwhelming majority of mass shooters had experienced early childhood trauma. The most prominent ACEs included parental suicide, physical and sexual abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. The growing evidence that childhood trauma is a valid predictor for the risk of perpetrated violence demonstrates the necessity for trauma-informed policy. Notably, early trauma screenings and systems that interact with children, such as schools, social services, juvenile justice, medical hospitals, and the like, have the potential to prevent, as Levin and Mathis described, children with problems from becoming problematic children. However, as noted with other risk factors, childhood trauma is but one part of a more complex dynamic. The presence of childhood trauma alone cannot predict mass shootings. In the Violence Project's previously mentioned op-ed, they also noted that in months before mass shootings, many perpetrators sought to validate their motives through media coverage of other mass shootings. This may explain why mass shootings tend to occur in clusters. For example, the last 4 mass shootings occurred on July 28th, August 3rd, 4th, and 31st. Sociologists, criminologists, and psychologists describe the cluster phenomenon as a result of contagion. Given the 24-hour news cycle and the general societal curiosity with and fear of mass shootings, at-risk individuals are all but promised notoriety. One study indicated that the copycat effect significantly increased the likelihood of mass shootings within 2 weeks of a highly sensationalized event. Interestingly, the contagion phenomenon appears to only apply to mass shootings and not other types of highly publicized crimes. This may be a result of increased media coverage of mass shootings that has been demonstrated to increase ratings and viewers, but especially highly detailed coverage that offers the name of the shooter, his or her background, in-depth interviews with witnesses and survivors, and graphic details, photos, and videos. Often this coverage inspires at-risk individuals to construct a plan aimed at generating a higher number of fatalities than the previous event. One of the first mass shooting incidents that typified sensationalized media coverage was the Columbine tragedy. Many have deemed this to be the most recognized mass shooting in modern history. This incident brought the idea of media contagion to the forefront of research on mass shootings. For example, one study found that the Columbine shooting inspired 74 like plots across 30 states. Further, it was discovered that the perpetrator of the worst school shooting in recent history, Virginia Tech, idolized the Columbine shooters. This anecdotally offers some validity to the notion that contagion killers seek to do more harm than their predecessors. It is essential to recognize, however, that individuals inspired by previous shootings were already considered at risk. While the previously discussed studies did not define at risk, one can assume that other factors, possibly related to chronic, uncontrolled, and acute strain, played a more significant role in the mass shootings. Perhaps it could be surmised that media contagion, as a triggering event, fits into the acute strain stage of cumulative strain theory. As previously discussed, the majority of public mass shootings have been committed by white men. It is first necessary to note that men represent the majority of gun owners in the United States. Given that black men are overrepresented in the commission of familicide and felony mass homicide, but white men disproportionately represent perpetrators of public mass shootings, researchers have gone to great lengths to determine the cause of these disparities. Across many studies, threats to white normative masculinity emerge as a central theme of causation. Eric Madvis, one of the developers of cumulative strain theory, stated of male mass shooters, "It is true that they are often people who have not performed their masculinity in ways that we traditionally value. It is an alternative route to achieve their masculinity by committing a mass act of violence." Adding to Madvis's statement, some studies that examine disparities between the commission of violent crimes by males as opposed to females assume that stronger adherences to masculine norms resulted in more volatile reactions to strains that threaten their ego and self-esteem. To explain racial disparities, however, researchers point to social structural factors. Structural advantages such as white hegemony and entitlement, especially related to heterosexual masculinity, when threatened and combined with previously mentioned factors, can have catastrophic effects. For example, one study found a positive relationship between income inequality and the occurrence of mass shootings. When men, especially white middle-class men, experience an economic downturn, due to structural advantages, unexpected losses tend to be more shameful, as they present not only a threat to their masculinity, but also their white hegemony. According to Madvis, the interaction between triple privileges, heteromasculine norms, and the cumulative course of failures may explain why white men in particular are more likely to commit mass shootings. As demonstrated by research, the problem of public mass shootings is complex. Adding to the complex set of factors, the rarity of these tragic events and the inability to create experimental conditions make research difficult. While the data sets for violence studies provide a fair amount of data, research on public mass shootings often rely on small sample sizes, case studies, and secondary data sets. So not only does previous research call on further studies of causation, but it also suggests that other ways of studying public mass shootings need to be developed. Like Bronfenbrenner's bioecological perspective on human development, no single or isolated factor is implicated in adverse reactions to chronic, uncontrolled, and acute strain. Instead, the interplay between personal factors, environmental factors, and socio-demographic factors within the context of cumulative strain calls on legislators to direct their focus on social programs that address early risk and predictive factors. For example, Project Safe Neighborhoods is one of only a few juvenile gun violence prevention programs that recognize the connection between violence and childhood trauma. While PSN is a federally funded grant program, the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies has recently called for the program to be defunded. The future of mass shooting prevention is mostly contingent on several factors: the further exploration of causal pathways, social programs, trauma-informed communities, media responsibility, and policy. Given the complexity of the problem, a collaboration between researchers, policymakers, state and local leaders, and community members is essential to the development of a comprehensive prevention plan. Though not all mass shooting tragedies can be avoided, the focus on reactive responses rather than proactive measures is not likely to decrease their prevalence.